Hello, welcome to Path to Programming. Today we're going to talk about how to take user input. Taking user input is extremely important. It's going to become necessary as we move on to bigger projects, and we're going to be using it in the next video too when we learn how to build a calculator for the first time. But let's talk about the actual syntax for how to take input from the user. In reality, it's just as simple as typing input and then parentheses. But if we have this line alone, it won't actually do anything. You'll notice that if we click the run button, nothing is printed in the console, and that's because the console is looking for our input. We called the input function on line 1, and we can type something into the console, and we would just press the enter button, but nothing actually happens to that. So what we would need to do is store that input inside a variable or something like that, and we could just print that variable. So now when I run this program, I can type something into the console, and now it's printed back. So just to make it clearer, I can add a little phrase and say your input was. So now I can just type something, and it says your input was hello. So this is really as simple as the input program gets, but what we really need to notice is that everything that we take in as input from our program is a string, and that's the way that Python works. So we talked about the different types of data that you could take in our first lesson, and just to reiterate, those were the numbers, strings, and then booleans. And strings were just everything that we included inside two quotation marks. So that would mean letters, phrases, numbers, words, whatever we want to type inside those two quotation marks are a string. So in this scenario, your input was colon and then a space. That's all a string. But what this means for like greater implications is that if we want to do something with that input, for instance, math, we can't just directly do it. And that's because the computer can't process something like this, like quotation mark 7 plus 5, because that doesn't mean anything. The computer doesn't know how to add a phrase or like words to a number. And that's why in Python we have something that we can do called typecasting. So what that means is that we're just casting the type onto another type. So to simplify that, I'll use an example. So let's say we want to take in our input, and then we want to print out x plus 5. So you'll notice if I run this program right now, and I just type 7, we're going to get an error. And if you look at the actual error, it says it's a type error. Can only concatenate string, not int, to string. So since it's a type error, we know that it's an issue with the data type that we're talking about. And that's because when I take the input and I store it in x, that's all a string. The computer doesn't know whether what you're entering is going to be a number or a symbol or a phrase, so it just takes it in as a string anyway. So to get rid of that, we just have to assign x to the integer value of x. So in programming, I know like in the first video we talked about data types, but within that category of numbers, there's sort of two ways to go about it. The first is like integers, we talked about, which is just sort of whole numbers like negative or positive. And those are integers, just numbers that we don't have any decimal points or anything like that. And then there's floats. Floats are also numbers, but they're just ones with decimal points. So that would be like 1.34, 5.67, anything with a decimal point that's not just a whole number like 1, 2, or 3. So in this case, it's a simple program. We're going to assume that the user is only going to enter like whole numbers like 7. So all we have to do is take that x, that input, and make it an integer by just typing int and then those parentheses. And this is sort of like another key moment where you can realize what we learned in our last video, which is about functions. Whenever we have these two parentheses, we're always dealing with a function. So on line 1, we say input and then those two parentheses, which means we're invoking or calling that input function. On line 2, we say int and then parentheses x, which most likely means we're just passing in the argument of x to the int function, and that's going to return an integer. And then we have print, obviously we're calling the print function and we're giving it the value of x plus 5. So it just takes that and puts it in the console. So now let's try our program. So we run this and I can just say the input is 7 and now we get 12. So that's because the computer now was able to take it, and so on line 1, originally our input was quotation mark 7, but then on line 2, that changes to just the integer 7. So on line 3, when we're trying to print, what the computer is looking at is just 7 plus 5, and that it can process. So it's able to print. But that's what typecasting looks like. Aside from that, Python has a lot of interesting features that you can use with input. For example, you can actually put a phrase inside of the input, and you can just say like enter a number, for example, and actually we'll say enter an integer to be more specific. And so now if we run this program, Python is like really nice to us, and they will automatically take that phrase and they'll just put it into the console, and then whatever the user enters, so let's say like 7 again, and then they hit enter, then it just works the same way. So that's one nice feature that we have with input. We can enter a phrase and then it'll automatically print it out for us. But that's sort of the basics of it. The very last thing that you need to know about taking input is just the float sort of typecasting thing that I was talking about. So let's say we can say enter a number, we can say enter a float, and we just have to change line 2 to say float instead of int, and then we'll print x plus 5.7 on line 3. So what this means is now we run the program and it's expecting sort of a float or a number with decimals, and so I'll enter like 8.95, and again, the computer still takes this in as a string, so it'll be quotation marks 8.95, but then on line 2 we do typecasting, and that basically just changes the type of 8.95 from a string to a float, and after that we can finally do the math and all the operations that we want. So I'm gonna hit enter, and as you can see, it printed it out, and so we have 14.46999 repeating. I'm just gonna make it plus 5 and we'll try it again. But you can see you can pretty much enter any number here and you get an output like that. So that's pretty much the basics of taking user input. This is gonna be really important in the next video because we're gonna use pretty much everything we've learned so far. Variables, functions, taking user input, conditional statements, all of that together to make a very simple calculator. And it's gonna be a cool project for you to do at home. So I suggest you follow along.